Good morning, everybody. It's Laurie White back once again with another edition of Chamber TV. It's episode number 140. And today, a very timely topic. We're going to be talking about pre-employment screening, particularly during the pandemic and what's changed. And we have a fantastic subject matter expert with us today, Joe Rotondo, and he is president of New England Background Screening Consulting, longtime member of the Greater Providence Chamber. Good morning, Joe. How are you today?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Looking forward to hearing all about this interesting topic and the whole notion of pre-employment screening, background screening. All of that is a very complicated subject with all kinds of regulatory and compliance issues truly at stake. But I imagine, Joe, that it's become even more interesting and complicated and touchy, if you will, as an outgrowth of the pandemic. So I am looking forward to seeing your deck. We are live here on Chamber TV, and most definitely welcome anybody that has any questions to put them in the chat box. Joe has graciously agreed to pause his presentation. So if you hear something that you have a question about, pop it in the chat box and we will pose your question to Joe. We have roughly an hour, a little short of an hour, to go over these topics, and looking forward to it. So Joe, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And of course, thank you to the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce for allowing me to do this presentation today. And the topic is employment screening, or some would call them background checks. And we're going to touch upon how the pandemic affected background checks. But I'm going to go a lot more beyond that because, as was just mentioned by Laurie, the fact that there's a lot of regulation around background checks. And I've got to say, it was very tough because I don't know the audience in terms of how well you're versed on employment screening and background checks and the laws. So I'm going to touch upon these things. To some folks, they may be, well, I know this already, but a lot of folks who may not be familiar with some of these things, it will prove useful. And again, having done presentations on the laws regarding background checks for many, many years, I know a lot of folks would say to me, Joe, I come on your presentations every year just to hear it one more time. So even if some of the topics are familiar to you, it's always been a good thing for folks to hear some of these topics one more time. So I'm going to jump right in. And how do we get to the employment screening that is being done in this day and age? And somewhere around 1988, things did change. So for years prior to that, a lot of companies considered a background check just contacting somebody's past employer, which was pretty minimal in this day and age. But that's what most companies did, just called up and get a reference or two. Myself, I personally conducted polygraph or lie detector tests back in the day. Did it for about 10 years in the New York City area. And we had a lot of clients at that time who were in the retail industry, a lot of jewelry manufacturers, pharmacies, who utilized the polygraph test to actually conduct pre-employment screening. So things did change, as you see, in around 1988, where the federal government got involved. They felt that polygraph tests maybe weren't the right tool to utilize in employment screening. And they passed the Polygraph Protection Act of 1988. And that pretty much outlawed polygraph testing in the private sector. Occasionally you may see in the news where someone was given a polygraph test, or maybe were accused of a crime or a witness or something. Well, those type of tests still are doable. The police, the FBI still use polygraph tests. But employment screening pretty much has been eliminated. So it was pretty interesting watching on television on, I guess it was C-SPAN, the Senate hearings to actually outlaw my job. And so what we set apart to do is to get into background screening. So, and I was working at the time for a consumer reporting agency, or CRA. And in this role, I was involved with operations, account management, and eventually compliance. So it's a little bit about how we got to where we are today, is from my personal experience. So what is employment screening? What are background checks? Basically looking to verify information on applicants. Now, typically, background checks can vary in terms of what is in a background check. So I've listed here what I have found to be the most common services as part of a background check. The Social Security trace report typically starts off the background check. Criminal history searches, sex offender database search, education, employment screening and verifications, when needed, professional license verifications, a motor vehicle search, employment credit checks, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, and a drug test. So those would be the typical services. And you might say that there's some other service. Certainly, there are some minimal services out there beyond these, but this, from my experience, this is pretty much the list of where companies choose and what they want to run in terms of the background check. So I think it's important to review these services to get started and show what's part of a background check. And the first type of service or search is called a Social Security trace report. Now, this report is not actually a Social Security verification, so that does not come out of this particular type of search. Okay, but what it does do, it reviews, it shows you an applicant's address history, and also will show you alias or other names that the person may have gone by. So when people feel like, well, you're doing a background check, how do you know, if the person had another name or they've lived in different places, how do you know where to search? This is the typical search service utilized to run a thorough background check. It's the Social Security search report. So again, not a Social Security verification. That would be done by a different type of service. Then, to me, the most important part of a background check is the criminal history search. So how is this done and where is it found? Typically starts with a county criminal search, okay, but also could search at the state, in some cases, doing a state criminal search. And then there were also federal level searches. Now, one clarification about federal search, I find this confuses folks, the fact that this is not a nationwide database type search. This is a search that searches federal convictions, okay? There were 94 federal courts in the United States, and so this is a separate search from a county or state search. Typically, federal crimes that would show up are things like kidnapping, money laundering, organized crime, identity theft. So they're pretty major type crimes. But again, it is a separate system from a county level or state level search. How are the searches done? Typically, they're done with the person's name and date of birth. So the first question I usually get is, well, why aren't you using Social Security numbers to do criminal history searches to make sure you're getting the right person? Most courts do not house the Social Security numbers in the public records. Why is that? Well, if you had the person's name and date of birth and they published a Social Security number in the public record, identity theft would be quite easy for someone to accomplish. So typically, Social Security numbers are not there and are not used at the beginning of the search. And what information do you get back from a criminal history search? Again, if you're doing these searches, you certainly know that you see the date the person was arrested, what were the charges, what was the arrest for, then the date of the disposition of the case, or when the case was concluded, the actual disposition, was the person found guilty, not guilty, etc. And then the sentencing, whether the person got a sentence of probation or jail or prison, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what comes back typically from a criminal history search. There certainly can be some other information, but those are the typical pieces of information that you would get back. Alrighty, the next search is the National Sex Offender Public website. Okay, this is a nationwide sex offender search, and very clear what this is. It identifies individuals who have had to register as a sex offender. So if an individual has moved, they need to always re-register in the state they moved to. Again, some wonder, well, what if the person leaves a state they were convicted and were registered? What happens if they leave the state? Well, again, they would need to register in the new state. And if they don't register and caught, obviously they would more than likely get sent back to prison. But again, this National Sex Offender Public website is a nationwide search. And why would you have to run this search when you're running a criminal history search I just described? Typically in the criminal history search, you wouldn't get this information. Now, in some cases, county to county, state to state, but this would be a separate search that would be needed to find out if the person is a registered sex offender. All right, then we come to employment screening services such as employment verifications and education verifications, as well as professional license verifications. So most employers, again, if you guys are an employer, you work in HR, typically when someone would contact you, we find in this day and age, most employers are only verifying dates and position. Again, you may get someone on the phone who tells you a little bit more, maybe why the person left, maybe any details that you would like to hear. But we find more often than not, it's dates and position that are being verified. With education verifications, it's typically verifying the receipt of a degree, and usually it's done at the highest level. So if the person's graduated high school and then went on to graduate college, typically you only verify the college, although I have had some clients that also wanted to verify the high school. It's certainly their option, and if they want to pay more to do that, that's up to them. But typically it's the highest level attained. And then professional license verifications, again, very important in certain industries, whether it be accountants, attorneys, healthcare, where it's necessary to verify that the person actually has the type of license that they claim to have, as well as any type of disciplinary actions that may be in their record. So those are professional license verifications. And motor vehicle searches, I think we're all familiar with that. I assume all of us drive, and motor vehicle searches would show you whether the person has any violations, suspensions, revocations, and accidents, and any other kinds of convictions. Typically, this search is only done for applicants who are applying for a job where they're driving a company vehicle or driving a company truck. Again, it's not really relevant to a lot of types of positions. I find clients not doing it unless it is job related, which would be our recommendation always. And then employment credit checks. This always has been one of the more controversial pieces of a background check. And frankly, through the years, I found companies doing less and less of credit checks on their applicants. As we all know, on a credit check, if you've ever seen your own credit report, it's going to show you the current debts, if there's any bankruptcies in the last 10 years, judgments, and their payment history. Now, for employment credit checks, if you needed to run a credit check and a person, the applicant is kind of hemming and hawing about having you do that, the Fico score, which we all know is part of when we're applying for loans, credit cards, et cetera, is an important score. The employment credit check does not affect the FICO score. Okay, so that is usually one of the reasons people hesitate to allow a prospective employer to run a credit check. So the FICO score is not affected at all by this. It's indicated on the report, actually, that's an employment credit check. So that would not affect their score. And we're going to see later, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the states that actually have passed legislation restricting the running or the use of credit reports in employment screening. And again, when I'm talking about credit reports here, it's just employment screening. I'm not referring to any of the credit reports that are run when you're applying for a mortgage or a loan, et cetera. Okay. So we're going to move on to something that actually has not been done for a long time period, going back in the background checking history, and that would be the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And this is straight out typically called a terrorist watch list. And we found a lot of organizations throughout the country, certainly especially after 9/11, wanting to confirm or verify that their applicant is not actually on this list and that they are not a known terrorist. So important search for many organizations in the U.S. And employment screening, again, part of a background check. Obviously, drug testing is a separate type of service, but I always find it's important to mention it. I'm not going to go deeply into drug testing, but as you see there, it's an important part of background checking to most organizations. I find that in the education field, actually, it is not. Most of the universities I've worked with through the years do not do drug testing, which always has amazed me. But most other types of organizations do have a drug testing program. And according to the NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, certainly employers who conduct drug testing find a decrease in absenteeism, reducing accidents on the job, improving productivity, and reducing turnover. And the finding is that if you have a well-constructed drug policy, it helps a company maintain a safe workplace and certainly reduces liability. Before actually I go on to that, I just wanted one more thing about drug tests. And so what's in a drug test? And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but pre-employment drug tests typically have marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, PCP, opiates. Companies can test for other drugs. And when I mentioned marijuana, we're going to talk about this a little later also. Some companies actually have stopped testing for marijuana just because of basically a lot of the laws being passed through this country. So as I've said to clients, certainly the drug test is still an important part of employment screening. Even if you eliminate marijuana, I would think most employers would want to know whether the person is involved in any as we call hard drugs, like I've mentioned, opiates and amphetamines, etc. All right, so I'm going to stop there and take a breath and a sip of water. Laurie, have any questions come in regarding the services of background checks?
Yeah, we have had a question about the degree to which all of this is public information. Is this information that perhaps an individual could request on his or herself in advance?
Interesting. So credit reports are not part of a public record. But again, if you're asking whether a person could get that on their own, you are allowed to have a free credit report every year. So you would just pop on to just Google that and you can run your own credit report. But that is not part of a public record. That would be your own. And as far as running the other services, it's an interesting question because running a motor vehicle search, I guess you can go to your state and get your motor vehicle report. Employment verifications, education, there was no reason a person would want to get that. Well, maybe contacting your school, because I have found some instances where a school hasn't updated their record or they have a mistake in their file and an individual is not listed as having graduated when they actually did. So you can contact a university and or a high school to verify that they have your record correctly in their system. Professional licenses, I guess the same thing. There are typically websites in different states for the different types of licenses you could verify on your own. And what else? Criminal history searches. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but typically there are some online up-to-date searches you can run. And, I know people who have been arrested and possibly convicted sometimes want to see if the record's still there. So there are ways of getting it, but a lot of the online searches aren't really that accurate, so it is tougher to find out. I would recommend if somebody had an arrest record in their background to check in with their attorney who handled the case to actually maybe pull the file and see what is there. There are times people think their records have been expunged, and in reality, they're not expunged, they're still there. So I would probably work through the attorney to have them pull the record. Mm-hmm. I think that's most of the services.
Okay. You have other pieces in your deck to present to us?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about why should an employer actually do a background check now that we've seen what's in a background check. And again, a lot of these things are pretty straightforward. And, you really want to confirm that the applicant is who they say they are in terms of what they've done in their work history, their education. I don't think a month goes by where we don't see someone out there where the media has found that the person actually doesn't have a PhD or doesn't have a degree. There have been cases where individuals, it's hit the media, where they've been fired. They claimed to have been something that they weren't. And so that always coming up. So it's really important to actually verify who you're hiring. We find also a higher applicant pool. So here's an example. I remember doing work for a nationwide retailer, and they hadn't put together a background checking program yet after the polygraph was outlawed. And then what they were finding was they were just not getting good candidates because they were getting the people who had been rejected by other retailers who actually were running background checks. So they quite quickly set up a program to conduct background checks. So just an interesting effect of not running a check where others are running them. Oh, what else? Find that there's lower turnover, actually saving money by keeping the employees longer because you've done your due diligence and background check, and then reducing exposure to negligent hiring and negligent retention. And I did want to spend a moment on this. This is a really become an important part of background checks because employers have, as I say here, a legal duty to ensure that an applicant doesn't present a danger to their organization or to the public. So negligent hiring lawsuits have really become a big problem for organizations. And what is negligent hiring? Well, it happens when an employer does not reasonably do a background check or fails to act when hiring an applicant and finding information on that individual, and that person subsequently harms someone either in your company or in the public. And then you have negligent retention, which basically is holding on to an employee once you do find out that there's something in their background that presents a danger, again, to the company or to the public. And I have a couple of examples here, fairly recent. This one I found at SHRM, a Society of Human Resource Management. And this is a case where a young man was actually shot by a coworker after a job-related situation. And sadly, the individual passed away. And the court documents actually show that the person who did this, who shot that employee, a coworker, revealed the man was actually on bail. And he had previously pulled a gun at someone in a store and also pulled a weapon on someone at a former job. And the court opined that the employer did not conduct an adequate background check. And as you see, awarded $1.2 million to the victim's wife. So a really sad case there of a company not completing their due diligence. And this just happened. This is a case from August, where in Florida, a jury issued a total of, and this is not a mistake, $1 billion in damages against two trucking companies who were found negligent in hiring their truck drivers. So in this case, the trucking companies did little or nothing and allowed these drivers to be on the road. Specifically, one of the drivers actually was hired with no background check, did not have a commercial driver's license, and their motor vehicle record showed violations, accidents, driving aggressively, speeding. So just a terrible job. And again, there was a death involved in this in these accidents, and $1 billion, unbelievable. So negligent hiring has become really, really a major thing out there. So again, why do a background check? This certainly would be a major reason. All right, I'll stop there. Take another breath. Laurie, any questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, the services that you're touring on. What is, I guess I'm sure it depends on exactly what you want to be screened, but what is relatively, the cost of doing a background check?
Okay, cost always enters into the picture of, definitely when you're reviewing with the prospect or client in terms of how much they can afford to spend. It's hard to give a specific number, although I will, because of the fact that You can do a minimal background check, maybe just do, as I'm going to suggest in a few minutes, a criminal history search and a sex offender database search. Or then in jobs where you need to verify a person's education, but some jobs, education is irrelevant. So, we recommend tailoring the background check to the position and only running the services that are relevant to the position. I gave a couple of examples, like running a credit check. And again, I'm talking a little bit more about this. In some cases, it's not relevant. Running a motor vehicle search, and in many cases, is not relevant. So we would suggest to that organization, don't run those services because of the fact that they're not relevant to the position. So a cost of a background check can run anywhere from, teens to hundreds and hundreds of dollars. I mean, some companies go full blast and do every particular service and every particular name, address where the person's lived, every reference that the person has in their background, every school they attended. So it can get expensive. And again, some organizations feel better to spend the money on a thorough background check than get hit with, as we've seen, some of these litigation, some of these lawsuits with negligent hiring.
Yeah, you mentioned negligent hiring, and I think people are pretty much aware of that. But the negligent retention, I think that might be a new concept to some folks.
Yeah, well, this is interesting. The background screening industry, where continuing background checks have become much, much more important to many organizations. Why? Well, you did that pre-employment screening, the person, everything was good, but what happens after they've been employed? And we're finding the statistics show that there's a certain percentage of people who end up getting arrested, maybe not convicted, but still it's something you would want to know. And we're not suggesting the person should get terminated based on that, but it is something you may want to know. And so the continuing background checks are important, again, to alleviate the possibility of negligent retention, where the fact that you find out that that person has done something and you act upon it. So yeah, that is an expanding part of employment screening, no doubt.
So how does that work? Do you, if you're the HR professional in a company, like once a year, you say, okay, here's my entire census, turning it over, run the background checks on everybody that I have employed here and make sure that nobody has, done anything that they should be aware of?
That is one way of doing it on a yearly basis. Some do it on a continuing basis, day to day. There is an ability to do that. Again, there's a cost factor. Some do it quarterly, doing it 4 times a year. And now, again, you wouldn't rerun all the services. You typically are looking for the criminal history search to see if the person has, again, been arrested and or convicted in the time since they were hired, a sex offender database search. And those would be the 2 typically recommended. If it's a driver, of course, you're running a motor vehicle search. And that is one that a continuous motor vehicle search, I'm finding, is something that companies are utilizing, because you don't want to get in a situation where, again, the person had a clean driving record when you hired them. However, when they were employed, and you didn't know this because you didn't run it again, they have some things in their motor vehicle record that their license got suspended, et cetera, and you need to know that right away. So that's a search that we'd recommend on driving positions be done in a continuous basis.
I was going to save this question till the end, but I just can't wait to ask this to you, because I think people out there that are in hiring roles today, what are they saying to themselves? We can't find people. Okay. It's hard to get people to work even under the most lax of circumstances. So my question is, once you layer on all these pieces, I mean, it must truly, particularly the marijuana screening as an example, and the drug testing, the degree to which it culls the potential working population even more. Interesting phenomenon in the post-pandemic world. So I'm thinking that's what you're going to lead up to, but I had to introduce that concept right away.
Certainly well aware of the challenges in hiring, and seeing all the help wanted signs in the area. It's just crazy. But keep in mind, I'll throw some statistics out there from my experience in terms of drug testing. And we found about a 3% positive rate to drug testing. So 97% of people pass drug tests. And especially, and if you take out marijuana, which many companies are doing, it would go down even further. Okay. And what about criminal records? Well, approximately 5 to 10% of applicants have a criminal record. So again, you're dealing with maybe approximately 90% of people who don't have a criminal record. And remember, if somebody has a criminal record, that doesn't mean they should automatically not gain employment. You know, people committed a crime and got convicted many years ago. I use an example. Somebody's 35 years old and they did something stupid when they were in college, which is now 10, 15 years ago. Typically, most companies don't hold that against somebody and they would hire that individual. And the same with a drug test. If they were testing from all the different drugs and the person shows positive for marijuana, I've met so many employers who say to me, Joe, I don't care about marijuana. And they would hire the person. So even having something in their background or on a drug test doesn't preclude them from gaining employment. So we don't look at it as this would be a deterrent to hiring and make it even more difficult. But there are people who, again, you maybe wouldn't put in a position if something were to show in their background.
Yeah, that's interesting. Some of our employers that work with the federal government, as an example, share with us the issues around employment, candidates coming in and being able to pass the drug test and the challenges that they in fact are having with that. So I have heard a bit more, I don't know, skepticism or just worry that the candidate pool, in fact, won't be applicable to someone that does have a federal contract.
Yeah. Well, different industries have different, again, rules, regulations in terms of their hiring practice. Since we've talked about drug testing, just one more thing. I've always said that drug testing is actually an intelligence test, because if you're out there looking for an employment and you're still using drugs, well, obviously, maybe you're really hooked on drugs and you can't help yourself. But since most drugs leave the system after around 2, 3, 4 days, it really becomes an intelligence test, drug testing. So just one more comment on that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the pandemic effect on background checks. And if you're running background checks through a third party, you already know this, that they were more challenging to complete than they took longer to complete. And I wanted to look just again back at a couple of the services, specifically like criminal history searches. So when the pandemic ramped up last year, some of the courts closed completely or limited the access to their records. Now, some of the background checking companies do have them electronically, that they are still up-to-date reports, but some organizations have to still send people to the courts to get the information. So that became certainly much more challenging. And keeping in mind that doing a database search, and I know this is getting in the weeds a little bit, the fact that there are, you see if you Google background checks or criminal history searches, there are $5, do a criminal history search. Well, a lot of those are database searches. They're not up-to-date information that's put in a database and it gets stale. So you really need to run the primary source searches, typically at the county level, possibly in some cases a state level. So running the database search, which again, maybe during the pandemic was necessary, but keeping in mind that according to the law that governs background checks, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA, the third party running them has an obligation to ensure that the information is complete and up to date. So this was certainly one major problem during the pandemic when companies couldn't get to those courts. So I just want to make it clear, most of the courts, if not virtually all of them, are back to normal in terms of being open. They may limit time. They may have certain rules put into place. But at this point, going back and doing the primary source search is important for organizations, not just running a database search. Okay. Now, what about employment, education, and professional license verification? This is, again, pretty obvious. If schools were closed, companies are closed, companies had limited hours that they had someone to answer questions, it became much more difficult to verify. So again, at this point, most of the schools and companies are back to fairly normal in terms of their hours and being open and available to do the verifications. One other thing to mention in terms of diplomas and college graduations, we've seen a lot of fake diplomas out there. So just having someone bring in a copy of a diploma, we find is not really enough. There's ways of doing it to make them look very real. So we certainly recommend still confirming with the college, university, that the person actually does have a diploma and not just seeing it. We don't think that that's really enough of a verification. Drug tests. So we've talked a little bit more about this than I thought we would, but this is fine. It is always a little bit of a controversial topic. So, when the pandemic hit, people, listen, a lot of us don't leave the house. So how do you do a drug test? So certainly that was a problem, and people having reluctance to leave the house when they were able to and going to a lab in terms of being afraid of being exposed to COVID-19. At this time, most of the labs are conducting employment drug tests for in-person visits. So it's, again, pretty much back to normal. And certainly companies had a decision to make whether to stop their drug testing or not. In regulated industries, that wasn't an option where they had to do a drug test. But at this time, drug testing is pretty much back to normal, but certainly was an issue during the pandemic. So one of the workarounds also then would be to do a post-employment drug test if you had to hire someone without the drug test originally in the height of the pandemic. Again, checking in terms of the state, making sure that they have no law that would preclude you from running a post-employment drug test. All right, so those are a couple of services and some of the effects. And should an organization stop screening? Again, I was asked this question many times by employers. Should we just stop doing it now since it's taking longer and et cetera? And to me, it just didn't make sense to stop the screening program. One of the options that we recommended was the fact of doing whatever background checks were available, whatever services were still available at the time. And then if something came up later when you would be able to do the background check and complete it, then you maybe would look into, terminating someone, but, working with your attorneys to make that decision. And, again, we just found that stopping it completely put organizations at risk in terms of, again, going back to the negligent hiring that we talked about already. And some more concern was the fact that if you stop running a background check, it kind of minimized the importance of background checks. And if there was to be litigation somewhere, it'd be, well, you stop running background checks, you were hiring people without background checks. What do you need background checks for? So that would be another issue with stopping the background checking program. The feeling was, as I see here in the second bullet point, prioritizing the background check and running whatever criminal history searches were available and running the sex offender database search. So at least you have, again, what I consider personally two of the more important pieces of the background check. And if you couldn't verify employment or some of the other things, well, you would just do that post-hire and hope, obviously, that the person did tell the truth. And if not, you have an issue at hand, which, again, you would consult with your attorneys and your HR folks to determine whether you should terminate that individual or not at that time. All right, conditional hiring. This was another option that companies had during the height of the pandemic in terms of, and I've kind of touched upon this already, and this would be stipulating that a background check needs to be completely successfully completed, be it at the beginning of the employment or at any point during employment. So if you experienced the delays, this was another option in terms of doing some conditional hiring. It's not what we typically recommend in normal times, but again, was a viable workaround to make sure that you were at least putting out there the fact that you're going to be doing a background check, even if you couldn't complete all the services at first. Okay. Keep in mind, there are some organizations or government jobs that actually had to fulfill and complete a background check. So certainly those individuals maybe didn't have as much of a choice. In my experience, what did companies do during the pandemic? I found most of them stayed with their programs. They did as much as they could. They took back as much information as they could and dealt with it at that point. And again, many of them then finished up the background check if there were certain things that they couldn't do during the pandemic. So that was my personal experience, finding that companies wanted to continue to do the background checks. All right, so again, let me stop there. Any questions on this part?
We have a question or a comment from Peg, and she is talking about the when we were talking about the retention, negligent retention. She notes out that we run monthly driving record checks on any employee who receives a driving allowance, and that's typically a sales team member. So, so what you're talking about here is pretty all encompassing in terms of the need to, to really keep these background checks going on a regular basis for sales team members. So, who would have necessarily thought that that was something that at least looking at this from the outside in, that was something that was really important to an employer.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. Again, driving position being, I would say, probably the number one type of continuous background check that I saw clients performing. And again, based on an example of the litigation that we saw, it's really important. Alrighty, I know we don't have a lot more time, and I did still want to touch upon legislation and background checks, whether it be during the pandemic or after or post or before pandemic. And again, some of you may know these things. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The Fair Credit Reporting Act is basically the law that governs background checks. And you as an employer, if you're utilizing a third party, a background screening company, you would have signed an end user certification. You always need to get consent of an applicant before you do a background check to a third party, and then you have to process the adverse action, which is a two-step process. And just again, quickly, the end user, you would sign off on this at the beginning of a relationship with a background screening company. You must have a permissible purpose to do a background check. Okay, the applicant again has to sign consent, and you must do agree to do the adverse action process. Disclosure and authorization. So again, this is the name of consent forms, and it means the same thing. So you're disclosing to the applicant what you're going to be doing, and then they're authorizing you to complete the background check through the third party. We've talked about continuing background checks. The state of California, some have the opinion that in California you need to have a background check and consent signed each time. Again, it's a controversial issue, so I'm not going to get too deeply into it. It's for the folks out on the West Coast, but the other 49 states, as long as the language is in the consent form that allows you to run a continuing background check, it is okay. There's also federal summary of rights. Some states have summary of rights that need to be distributed, and a disclosure form needs to be a standalone form. Okay, adverse action. This is a two-step process. I know some of these things seem like, wow, it's a big burden, but once you're doing it, it really is not that difficult. Plus the fact that a lot of the background checking companies or consumer reporting agencies are actually doing a lot of these processes for companies. So the adverse action is when you find something in the background check and you want to eliminate that person and disqualify them, you need to provide them with a letter, a pre-adverse letter. And in that letter, you would give them actually a copy of their report, and again, summary of rights, and they were allowed to contest that information if they see fit, if they think there's a mistake in their background check. I'm skipping ahead, and days later, usually typically at least 5 days later, if the person does not dispute, you want to disqualify the person, you would send them an adverse action letter. Again, and these are things that I certainly cover in other webinars, and I'm just zipping through them quickly. Ban the box legislation, really important, where on the initial job application, you shouldn't be asking the person a question such as, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Have you been convicted in the last 7 years? Questions of that nature. Rhode Island has a ban the box law, so you should take a look at your application and at least have it reviewed by your attorney to make sure that it is legal in terms of not having that question on there. Some places like New York City and Los Angeles have fair chance laws, which again, I don't have the time to really go into that now, but it is something important. Ban the box, banning that box on the application where it asks the question if the person has a criminal record. As I mentioned earlier, with credit reports, there are states and jurisdictions that have restricted the running or the use of credit checks in the pre-employment situation. New York City, it's virtually impossible to run a pre-employment credit check on an individual. There's some very limited exceptions. So again, please be careful if you need to run a credit report. And then there are laws that are called pay equity or salary history bans, whereby you are prohibited as an employer from asking a job applicant about their past compensation, typically until you've made a job offer that actually includes compensation. Now, Rhode Island just enacted a pay equity law, which actually piggybacked on the current Rhode Island equal pay law. So again, be careful about asking about past compensation. Marijuana laws, we touched upon this earlier. So what I wanted to tell everyone here, there are some states and locations around the country that have passed marijuana type laws, and I'm just focusing on 3 of them here. The state of Maine prohibits employers from discriminating against employees for off-duty marijuana use. State of Nevada took it a step further. Employers are prohibited from denying employment if somebody fails a pre-employment drug test for the presence of marijuana. If you're a Nevada employer, you cannot use that as the reason to deny employment. And in good old New York City, well, pre-employment drug testing for marijuana has now been prohibited. So you cannot even test for marijuana there. And as I mentioned, that's why there are many companies now actually taking marijuana out of their pre-employment drug testing panel. EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, this is very important in the sense of utilizing criminal records in making employment decisions. Let's focus on the fact that you cannot, if the person indicates they've been arrested, which shouldn't even be a question on an application, you cannot utilize that if it comes back in the background check. A record that is not a conviction, our general advice would be not to utilize that information in the employment decision, along with other things. And, sorry about that. So let me jump to, are you guys ready? The 3 Ps in background screening, as I say here, in terms of policy. Do you have a policy of employment screening? Is it non-discriminatory? Have you had it vetted by legal counsel? Policy makes it easy for candidates to know what to expect. Second, are your processes consistent? Again, this makes it easy for the hiring manager in terms of what to do with background check. And lastly, do you have in place to ensure compliance with these laws, the things that I've just gone over rather quickly, but so making sure that you have compliance with the employment screening laws. So my organization, NEBSC, I can help companies evaluate and optimize their services. Maybe services you shouldn't be running. I've touched upon credit checks. I don't think you should be running credit checks on individuals unless it's job related. Same with motor vehicle. Reviewing your forms. Again, a lot of litigation out there about forms in terms that the FCRA requires. Liaison in terms of compliance issues. Helping with requests for proposals when you are seeking a new company to do your background checks. And training, certainly, staff members on the things relating to background checks. All right. So, Laurie, what else do we have in terms of questions?
Yes. So Janet asked a question about the recreational marijuana legalization and how that's impacted some states, and you've gone over that very thoroughly, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, just one more comment. It is still federally illegal. So again, we just caution companies to be careful, making sure in their particular state or jurisdiction that you're updated to the different marijuana laws. One way to basically cover is the fact of, if you're doing pre-employment testing, don't test for marijuana anymore, and certainly would have no issue.
One other question that has been raised, an interesting one in the post-COVID environment, you talked about falsification of certain documents. What about falsification of a COVID vaccination record?
Wow. Yeah, it's unbelievable how, there's always something new out there. Frank, I have not encountered this yet with any clients in terms of, I know I've read things in terms of people faking it. I would have to turn you back to your employment, to your attorneys to see in a particular state, city, jurisdiction. I don't know of any litigation out there yet. I haven't seen anything like that. I'm sure there will be at some point, but it is something I'd be very careful in terms of, first of all, accusing someone of faking it. So it is something that a whole new ball game when it comes to that type of situation.
Yeah, well, I've been around certain, places where you have to show proof of vaccination. You can show it on your phone. You can have a digital copy. But now I'm hearing that some places are saying, no, you have to show us the paper copy, not the digital version, in order to gain access to, a certain, event or activity
Right.
or school, university, place, company, etc.
So this is why it's so important to keep up to date on the different laws when it comes to employment screening and background checks and some issues with HR, which, again, folks just have to be real careful.
Couple of other things I wanted to mention. Back to the, the criminal background checks, and you were talking about it. A lot of employers are really sensitized to the notion of giving people a second chance. And I'll just mention a couple of years ago when Peter Nerona, who is the current Attorney General, was the U.S. Attorney. The Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office to talk about the benefits of hiring individuals who are leaving prison, as an example, and how important it is for an individual to get a job and to get a clean start. And there are lots of benefits of hiring someone that's on parole, because they'll have a buddy there, if you will. They'll have somebody that they're working with on a day-to-day basis, make sure that the person is continuing to, uphold the promises that they made. And in many cases, we're seeing that these types of individuals who have that in their background are really great employees because they have a variety of support services that are available to them. So I like the fact that you mentioned that, just because someone does have, and of course it depends on what the federal offense is.
Absolutely.
Everything's, dependent on
no question
circumstances.
There are different, there's certain things someone may have done in their past, which may be relevant to a particular job. Okay, so maybe that would not be a company the person should go to work for, but there's certainly other companies that would be able to utilize this individual, even though they have a particular criminal record. Or frankly, again, in a drug test situation where I use the example with marijuana, there are many employers who still will test for it, but they will not hold it against an individual and they will still hire the individual. So just doing a background check that has some negative information, it doesn't automatically mean the person shouldn't get a job, especially in this day and age and then you've just summed it up as to why.
Yeah. Are there any employers that don't need to do this kind of thing? Or where do you put it on the continuum?
There were certainly employers I've spoken to who tried to get to do background checks that have no interest in doing it. Again, we've gone through some of the risks. It just, sometimes it's because of a cost, but we've found, and there's certainly a lot of information out there and statistics that show by doing the background check is actually a cost savings rather than spending money. It's well spent money and will save a company money. I mean, everyone knows how hard it is to recruit people and the cost of recruiting an individual and hiring them. You always want to bring in a good individual, a solid individual who will become a long-time employee. But yet there's always the other side of the spectrum of someone who will always have the opposite opinion and possibly for whatever their reasons are, not want to do background checks. I did mention in academia, I have found that universities frown upon drug testing. Well, okay. Well, that's their thought process. I don't particularly agree with it, but that's what I found through the years of working with a lot of major universities. They do not do drug tests.
So I hate to put you on the spot with this question, but I think the viewers would be interested in your answer. What is the most eye-popping revelation you've ever discovered working on behalf of an employer?
I would actually give you an example of doing polygraph tests. Long story short, a company was missing a lot of jewelry. It was a jewelry manufacturer. I went in, did some polygraph testing. One of the bookkeepers did not pass the test. I know, look at my kind face, but I would actually do interrogations. And after a couple hours of questioning the individual, she confessed to stealing $54,000 of diamonds from that organization. And to end the story, they promised her if she gave back the diamonds, they would not prosecute. She did not give back all the diamonds. They prosecuted her. She got 6 months probation. So sometimes crime does pay.
Anything more recent than the polygraph?
Anything more recent in background checks? So just falsifying education. That seems to be a major one, whereby it just like the person got the job. They would have had the job even without the college degree, but they falsified the college degree, and then the company, the organization said, no, you falsified the application. You didn't need a college degree. That would be one that I find more often than not.
Yeah. Wow. People falsifying education. Interesting.
Yeah. You see it a lot of times in the media, cases like that. I think there was somebody who was going to be a Notre Dame football coach, and he falsified a bunch of years ago and didn't get the job because he lied about the education, which wasn't necessary to lie about it. But some folks have it through their resume and they never update the lie. And there you go.
Yeah. Interesting. What about LinkedIn? Like, do you look at somebody's LinkedIn profile and see if it matches?
That's one of the services I didn't get into, social media searches, which is something that background check companies can do for organizations. I didn't get into it because, again, it's a whole controversial issue, and it would take too much time to get into it. But what I would do is caution companies or HR folks who are doing it on their own, because once you see something, you cannot unsee it. So you have to be rather careful in doing searches on the internet, whether it be LinkedIn or Facebook or any of the other ones. So we have found that makes much more sense to actually outsource that to the third party, where they will screen out information or photos that you really shouldn't see in making an employment decision.
So what do you mean you can't unsee it?
Sorry?
So part of negligent retention?
Well, no, in hiring someone, if you see, for example, that somebody has a health issue or is disabled, and then you end up not hiring that person, having nothing to do with their disability, well, you've seen that. It's part of the report. That could be a problem with the fact that the person then hires an attorney who says, you didn't hire my client because they're disabled, when in reality, it wasn't really the reason. So doing social media searches or checking the internet on a person, and believe me, I know HR people do this all the time, even though they sometimes don't admit to it. I would recommend, again, outsourcing that to a third party where they will take out that interview. You'll never see that disability or the person's religion or sexual background. That stuff is all taken out of the social media report through a third party.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of these services that promise, to do a social media search on somebody and get any negative references or, referrals or any derogatory information attached to somebody's profile wiped clean? Is that a bogus type of thing?
Where somebody has done something and takes it out. Well, don't forget, if somebody's smart enough not to ever put something into their Facebook, it's not going to be there. So, frankly, I always caution folks when I even talk in my own personal life, people who are college age, et cetera, be really careful what you put out there. It may follow you around for a long time. Something that you may not be proud of years later when you're applying for that important position in your life. So, listen, people who are savvy maybe either don't put it out there or they do take it out. But so social media searches have some relevancy. I'm not a huge fan personally. Maybe that's why I didn't put it in my presentation. The fact that you have to be super careful about the information that you do find.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe, this has been a fascinating discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I know our viewers probably feel the same. But we have been talking with Joe Rotondo, and he's the president and founder of New England Background Screening. And you can reach Joe at newenglandbackgroundscreening.com. And I think, Joe, what would be the process if somebody wanted to learn more? What would you advise anyone?
Yeah, send me an email, give me a phone call, and if there's a particular thing, many companies utilize my services to do webinars. Again, some of the topics I covered today, but obviously in much more length, like Fair Credit Reporting Act and the laws, which I found through the years, unbelievably, companies clueless in terms of what they should be doing. There were a lot of great consumer reporting agencies out there. A lot of them are really good with their compliance training for their customers, but there are a lot of companies who really don't spend the time or the effort to do that. So I can be someone who would kind of fill in the gap of a company who uses a company. I don't do background checks, but certainly can talk to individuals about it and conduct training, conduct webinars, et cetera.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Joe. We really appreciate the attention to detail and the thoroughness. Obviously, you must be very busy these days because we are in a super competitive employee recruitment market. So I trust that you have all the resources that a potential employer needs to really bring in the best talent today.
Absolutely.
So that's it, everybody. We will see you next time here on Chamber TV. Thanks for watching. And as always, this webinar will be available on our website, providencechamber.com. It will be there in perpetuity, Joe. So if anyone wants to check it out and review it, rewatch it, it'll all be up there. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.